right. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's talk by Dr. Zev Eleff, which will be Authentically Orthodox, How Change Works in a Tradition-Bound Community. We extend a huge thank you to you, Dr. Eleff, for taking out the time to speak with us tonight. Before I say a few words of introduction, I'll just mention two housekeeping items. First, tonight's talk is being recorded and will be posted to the Hebrew Institute's YouTube channel. Also, if you have any questions as he's delivering his prepared remarks, feel free at any time to type them into the chat box. He will address them at the end during the Q&A session, however much time permits. He'll also invite people during the Q&A to unmute and ask questions just verbally. So now, a few words of introduction. Zev Eleff is Chief Academic Officer of Hebrew Theological College and Associate Professor of Jewish History at Touro College. He is the author or editor of 9 books and more than 40 scholarly articles in the field of American Jewish history. Dr. Eleff earned his PhD at Brandeis University under the supervision of Dr. Jonathan Sarna. He was ordained at Yeshiva University's Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. His most recent book, from which some of tonight's lecture is drawn, is Authentically Orthodox, A Tradition-Bound Faith in American Life. In it, Dr. Eleff challenges earlier historians' interpretation of Orthodox Jewish life. Rather than focus on rabbinical pronouncements or institutional decision-making, Dr. Eleff has studied lived religion, researching the actions and behaviors of the women and men who make up Orthodox Judaism in the United States. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Zev Eleff.
Okay, thank you so much to Shira Goldman, Diana Goldberg, and Rabbi Martyr. Confirm that we didn't confirm that I can share my screen, but should be okay. So the topic at hand is to grapple with this peculiar concept called authenticity. Let me just shrink myself on Zoom. And I find authenticity is a strange term, but as I studied American Orthodoxy for now about 15 years of reading, writing, and researching and teaching about Orthodox Judaism, it appeared to me that that word authentic appears much too often to take for granted. And to probe it deeply, and what I found was that we had somehow, when we talk about Orthodox Judaism, particularly in the United States, I think Israeli Orthodoxy functions much the same, but also quite different. We often talk about sliding to the right, a term that was coined by Sam Heilman, the great sociologist, for a long time just retired from Queens College. And sliding to the left. Sliding to the right, here's Heilman himself. The purpose of this volume, in a book aptly titled Sliding to the Right, then is to examine these developments, the developments of change, and that's really what he was looking at, in the context with an American Orthodoxy at the beginning of the new century, the 20th century. In particular, I seek to understand what was thought once to be the type of Jewish life and practice most ill-suited to and at odds with America, Haredi Orthodoxy. It had managed to secure itself here, and how the trend of Orthodoxy, once believed to be best fitted to survive here, modern Orthodoxy, here it's undercased, most often uppercased, now finds itself losing the ideological battle for its very survival. From, concludes Heilman, is giving way to from. And here on the right, much in vogue around that time, that it appeared around 2003, 2004, is A Parent's Guide to Orthodox Assimilation on University Campuses, co-authored by 2 PhDs, one at Penn and the other one at MIT, urging parents and young people to reconsider the Hillel and the college experience at any place other than Yeshiva University. a small little track, but one that gained significant attention and the rancor of Hillel rabbis at secular colleges. But it was evidence of a sliding to the right, not just even in the yeshiva world, but even in the modern Orthodox enclave. Two PhDs, made to this day significant figures, warning of the hazards of something that was taken for granted as certainly acceptable. On the other hand, there were those who talked not about sliding to the right. It's interesting. In my world, this is right and this is left, but as you're viewing, it's the other direction. Our hypothesis, writes a good friend of mine, Rabbi Yehuda Turetsky and Professor Chaim Waxman, our hypothesis is that American Orthodox Jewry, responding directly to Heilman, is much more heterogeneous than the above cited observers, mostly Heilman, perceived. That the modern Orthodox sector, again, undercase I don't understand, in particular, is neither of one stripe, nor has it overwhelmingly Harediized, and indeed, there have been some developments indicating significant ritualistic departure, not only from Haredi norms and values, but from traditional Jewish religious behavior as well. So here you have a machloket of scholars, some suggesting that in the last 20 years, Orthodox Judaism has slid to the right, others who argue, no, it's much more variegated than that, much more textured, it's to the left. And here you have, in 1997, the inaugural International Conference of JOFA, Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. They had anticipated only about 200 attendees, and then a little girl's bat mitzvah was banned by the Vada Queens. And so they received, and that's a cause celebrate, and they had about 900 in attendance. I've never tried to count that's what they claimed. I imagine that to be correct. Never tried to count all the people in the picture, but you gather that this is a major event, incredibly well attended, garnering significant interest. While it's absolutely the case that there's evidence of sliding to the religious right and sliding likewise to the religious left, it's happening at the same time and it's complicated. I definitely agree with the idea that orthodoxy is far more heterogeneous than to make sweeping claims of sliding to one direction or the other. But it was even before Heilman and his critics, it was Charles Liebman, the great sociologist of Jews in the United States and in Israel, who argued in the late 70s, Orthodoxy's current influence has a number of causes. By the late 70s, sociologists who in the 1950s had predicted Orthodoxy's demise at the hand mostly of conservative Judaism, saw a resurgence, almost a triumphalism. After all, you had scholars like writers, like Herman Wouk, who publishes This Is My God, which is a New York Times bestseller, assuming that Orthodoxy is here to stay. And so Jews of all types are looking to respond, and Liebman writes in the late 70s, in the fall of 1979, Orthodoxy's current influence has a number of causes. The most important one, I believe, is the sense of many non-Orthodox Jews that Orthodoxy is the voice of Jewish authenticity. The sense that Orthodoxy is the voice of Jewish authenticity may stem from the fact that Orthodoxy is a legitimate expression of the Jewish tradition by everyone's standard, meaning that while the Orthodox rabbinate would not consider a Reform conversion to be a valid conversion, Reform considers Orthodox conversion to certainly be certifiably valid. Everybody, the greatest common Orthodox denominator, argues Liebman, is an indication that Orthodoxy is seen as the most authentic or legitimate sense of religious faith. It doesn't mean they agree with it, but they can certainly stand by it. More important is that Orthodoxy speaks with a sense of confidence, that triumphalism that I had mentioned, about its Jewishness that the non-Orthodox lack. Orthodox Jews, Liebman, again, this is his opinion, not necessarily fact, but he looked around and saw that Orthodox Jews seemed to brim with a certain level of self-confidence that other Jews didn't. But I want to seize on that concept of authenticity because it appears everywhere. So going back to the 1960s for a moment, this is entering our third year. This is an editorial in the Agudas Yisrael's Jewish Observer from 1965. And if you take a look, what is our editorial frame of reference? We believe, I'm in the second paragraph, that the Almighty revealed his Torah to the Jewish people who are chosen to carry God's light to the world. We believe that the Torah scholars of each generation, imbued with knowledge of Torah and love for Torah, are the sole arbiters of authentic Jewish thinking on all matters relating to religious practice and religious thinking. So here, even religious authority is dominant in this particular brand of Orthodox Judaism, and we'll get to this later. I want to put a pin in it, is that even rabbinic authority is legitimate because it's seen as authentic. So how did we get here? So my charge was to take us to look at change in Orthodox Judaism from the end of the 19th we'll see if we can get to as close to today as possible. We're not going to make a stop at every single year. I'm conscious of the time. But a word about where Orthodoxy was at around the turn of the 20th century, so the very beginning of the 1900s. Here is Isaac Mayer Wise, the architect of Reform Judaism, essentially, in the United States. Writing the following. We'll pick it up with, you see the italics, or rather the Jews par excellence. We, explains Wise, are the Orthodox Jews in America. He's not Orthodox, he's Reformed, he's the architect of it. But rhetorically, we are the Orthodox Jews in America, and they, referring to the halakhically observant Orthodox, and they were the Orthodoxy of former days in other countries. But we're in America, after all. We can see no good reason why we should ogle you. We don't think you're legitimate. Allow you to act as a brake to the wheel of progress and confirm you in your pretensions. You do not represent the ideas and sentiments of the American Jews. This phase upon which Judaism entered in this country, you are an anachronism, strangers in this country and to your own brethren. He was just as unkind to certain elements within the Reform. You represent yourselves together with a past age and a foreign land, Frank Eastern Europe. We must proceed without you to perform our duties to our God and our country and our religion, for we are the Orthodox Jews in America. And then you see at the end, he offers similar comments. What does he mean by that? He doesn't mean that now that he has somehow triumphed over the so-called erstwhile Orthodox, that he's now going to be observant. But orthodoxy in Greek means the true faith. He's well aware of that. A very smart individual is Isaac Mayer Wise. We are the new orthodoxy. We are the new true faith. How can he make such a contention? Well, if you take a look at a poster of eminent Orthodox clergymen, so here so we can see it all. You have, I think, 12 profiles of rabbis. I apologize that the names are a little bit too small to make out, but 9 out of 12 of them would identify as Orthodox rabbis, or Orthodox clergymen. And what else is important? If you take a look, who are they? So, for instance, the one with a large yarmulke and the beard, supposedly without the mustache, is Morris Raphael. Well, he dies in the late 1860s. The clean-shaven fellow at 2 o'clock, if this were a clock face, is Isaac Leeser. He also dies in the 1860s. While this image indicates that the Orthodox rabbinate looms large in American Jewish life, eventually they died out and they weren't replaced. There wasn't a pipeline. So instead, people like, for example, David Einhorn, who's next to Raphael in the middle, on the right side of the middle, excuse me, that's Solomon Mayer Isaacs. But you had other, that's another Orthodox. But all of a sudden, it's the Reform who have the pipeline, who have succession, and they're taking the reins. And so Orthodoxy is already, forget about the 1950s. By the outset of the 20th century, Orthodoxy is now being buried by the Reform, and with good cause. There are, by the Reformed congregational body's records, there are hundreds of congregations that identify with the Reformed liturgy, and just a handful of synagogues which would pray with the Orthodox rite. There was an Eastern European migration in an attempt to establish a chief rabbi, Rabbi Yaakov Yosef, Rabbi Jacob Joseph. But if you take a look at the New York Sun, will he be an autocrat? Almost, and this was a time of severe anti-Catholicism. He was a failed chief rabbinate. A chief rabbi to whom? Writes, they interview Rabbi Bernard Drachman, eventually of the Upper West Side of New York, Reverend Dr. Drachman of the 72nd Street and Lexington, so he's on the East Side right now. Avenue Synagogue said, I think it very desirable. He thought he was all for the chief rabbinate that they brought, and he came with great pomp and circumstance, did Rabbi Jacob Joseph. And Rabbi Drachman says, I'm all for it. We could use some order around here. But who is he going to, who is his constituency? Of course, in the middle of the blown up section. It is a purely voluntary movement on the part of those congregations, about 18 or 19 of them that signed up to bring over and pay handsomely, I should add, this chief rabbi, which have brought Rabbi Joseph over here, and none need recognize him unless they wish to. We're in a voluntary society. We're not in Europe. We don't have state-sponsored religion. If you don't want to follow Rabbi Joseph's decree about burial rights, which he tried to create some sort of regulation about, then you don't need to follow. In fact, other rabbis, Rabbi Siegel, for example, who legend has it, also claimed to be a chief rabbi, and he put up a sign. He put up a shingle in front of his storefront, and somebody knocked on the door and said, Rabbi Siegel, who said you're the chief rabbi? He said, the painter. The painter, the person who painted the sign. In America's free market society and in the free market of religion, there could not be any concept of an official chief rabbi. And so Orthodoxy had to develop its own mechanisms to really rehabilitate itself in the 20th century. What was in vogue at the time wasn't in Orthodox Judaism that we would look at it today, but others like Cyrus Adler, eventually become the president of the Jewish Theological Seminary, would have probably identified as Orthodox, but it was he and other young people. If you look in the middle section, it's called a Jewish Renaissance. It was young people, not rabbis, and not anybody who identifies specifically as Orthodox, who were leading a religious revival in the 19th century. Orthodoxy was still very much in the nadir, and even in 1898, when Jews met, about a sizable delegation, in fact, met at Sheretz Israel, Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. And Henry Pereira Mendez was the rabbi at the time, to form what we now know as the Orthodox Union. They debated. Take a look at the minutes. Here's Dr. Drachman again. A statement of principles was read. Mr. Dembitz, the uncle of the eventual Justice Louis Dembitz Brandeis, objected to the use of the word Orthodox. So even the Orthodox Union, when it was founded, its credo planks, they weren't sure. They debated whether or not to use Orthodoxy in not only their name, but in their ideology. Still in the 20th century, tradition-bound Jews still couldn't get a handle on how to identify Orthodox or otherwise. And the Orthodox Union, which is essentially a paper organization, this is Henry Pereira Mendez on the right. He was the president of the Orthodox Union, or then the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America. And he writes a letter to a group in the seminary, of the Jewish Theological Seminary, that hadn't yet identified as full-fledged conservative. They too were toying with religious monikers. And he writes to my dear Adler, Dr. Schachter and Rabbi Cohn. This is an archival source from the American Jewish Archives. Mike Cohn, my good friend at the University of Tulane, was the first to find this. Dr. Schachter and Rabbi Cohn have both had several interviews with me concerning a proposed Agudas Yeshurun, or Union for Promoting Traditional Judaism in America. An organization it didn't take off, but here, unwilling to use the term orthodoxy, I have carefully examined the preamble to the Constitution and the sketch of the Constitution sent to me. I understand that you are chairman of the Constitution Committee, and I therefore write to you. In order to explain my views to you, let us for a moment agree to the following definitions, even if they are not exactly correct. So first he wants to outline what is the demographics or even the religious topography of American Judaism. First, there's Russian Orthodoxy. This is the Orthodoxy which insists upon a certain ritual and certain forms, but objects to English sermons. It was usher. It was absolutely forbidden. You needed 1904. The Agudas HaRabbanim makes it very clear they're not willing to allow any of its members to sermonize in anything other than Yiddish. Insists upon a certain ritual and a certain forms, objects to English sermons, has little or no decorum. You can see already he indicates his bias. Fails to hold its young men and women, refuses in its schools Hebrew and religious education to girls, and cares little whether women and girls attend religious service or not. It also insists upon such customs as the sheitel and, in a word, degrades womanhood as you and I understand. Here you see that already traditional Judaism is measuring itself based on where it stands on women's issues. Second, modern Orthodoxy. As represented by, for example, your and my congregation and several Ashkenaz congregations, such as those in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and Montreal, this orthodoxy resists innovations such as organs, pews, that means mixed pews, men and women sitting together, disuse of a talit, female voices in the choir, and Christians in the choir, etc. Third, a conservative Judaism. Again, it's very fluid. Lots of the terms, let this term, mean that the Judaism, which permits some of the innovations named above. And then Reform Judaism has even more innovations, and you see it's cut off a little bit, radical reform. So already rabbis are toying with the idea of establishing boundary lines in American Judaism based on rabbinic pronouncements and their own almost sociology of the terrain.
What year is this?
This is 1913. A good question. I think that the Zoom is blocking the very top. 1913. Very good question. Thank you. And there are other people using orthodoxy, modern orthodoxy, strict orthodoxy. So here at Kehillat Israel on Harvard Street in Brookline, Massachusetts, in 1925, it builds this edifice. It's paid off right before, literally the week before the crash a few years later. KI, just when they're prepared to move in, its president writes the following in its synagogue newsletter, volume 1, number 2. This is Joseph Rubin, the president of Kehillat Israel. They hadn't yet even moved into their very first building yet. A president's appeal. The problem of the seating arrangement at our temple, interesting use of the word there, was thoroughly debated at a meeting of February 25th, 1925, and fought out with an Australian ballot, that means a closed ballot, in accordance with a petition signed by 7 members of good standing who demanded that such a vote be taken. The results of the vote is known to all, known to them, not necessarily to us. So what was it? It was a question of mixed seating, and whether it was appropriate for an Orthodox congregation to have mixed pews. At first, when the question came up before the board meetings and members at large, I expressed my opinion, this is the president after all, and hoped that Kehillat Israel would remain in every way an Orthodox congregation. And I had hoped that we would have a sufficient number of Jews in Brookline of the type that would support a strictly, interesting term, strictly Orthodox synagogue. There were, however, an overwhelming majority of people who had given money toward the erection of the temple and who felt that this congregation should be what is called a modern Orthodox congregation. Apparently, a strict Orthodox congregation has separate seating, women in a ladies' gallery, and a modern Orthodox congregation that was termed that, again, not the same way that we refer to modern Orthodoxy today, was considered a congregation with mixed pews, mixed seating, men and women together, but could still retain the term in popular parlance of Orthodox. And in fact, when leaders of the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, eventually called Yeshiva University, were asked in 1928, so around the same time, by a congregation in Omaha, Nebraska, that was rabbiless, to please supply them with a religious leader. Sam Czar, its placement director, wrote back, "Please advise by wire what you mean by modern Orthodox congregation." Apparently that's how they describe themselves in Omaha, Nebraska. "Our graduates, while American-born, modern in the fullest sense of the word, are, however, strictly Orthodox." So again, not that Rudnick and Czar were trading lines here, but there was something very much in the air in the rhetoric in American Judaism at the time. Do you intend to have family pews in your synagogue? And likewise, an advertisement taken in the American Hebrew around the same time. This isn't for a congregation looking for a rabbi, it's a rabbi looking for a congregation. Prominent rabbi, thinks very much of himself, forceful orator, successful organizer, well-known scholar, 43 years old, at present in charge of a large congregation in the South, would consider change of pulpit only, so he's picky, conservative or modern Orthodox congregation desired. So again, all of these are examples of how Orthodoxy was still very much a debatable and contested term, and then exactly what was Orthodox. Orthodoxy was not synonymous with a Shulchan Aruch form of Judaism. It was something very much, there was a range of what could be considered Orthodox to the people there who were using the term. And that's the important point here, is that Orthodox Jews Jews were the people, human beings were the ones who determined what could and could not be Orthodox in the 1920s. And so what I want to take a look, with that as a background, I want to take a look to fast forward throughout the 20th, and we'll get to the 21st century as well, to understand how Orthodoxy takes shape, not with rabbinic pronouncements. It's really not until the 1980s when rabbis really truly gain a significant foothold in determining the contours of Orthodox Judaism, I argue. But it's everyday Judaism that helps form an orthodoxy in the United States. So first, I know that we have Purim before Pesach, but I find a very useful source is peanut oil. In the early 20th century, the archival literature is full of it. Particularly Jewish women would save chicken schmaltz. Starting on Hanukkah, they would store it in their icebox for months and months and months, so that they could use chicken schmaltz for cooking and baking on Passover, and even spreading it on matzah. And so Orthodox Jews were terrifically happy that Planters Peanut Oil and others had come out with peanut oil, which was certified kosher. What was the issue? Was whether or not peanuts and peanut oil was considered to be kitniot. Now, a little bit on the history of the peanuts. Peanuts are essentially indigenous to the United States. It was a southern food, a plantation food, until Northern Union forces brought it back up north while they had fought in the South during the Civil War. The circus, Barnum Bailey, made it quite famous. And it doesn't arrive in Europe until the 1870s, 1880s. The Samareba's grandfather was the very first one to deliver a Shabbos HaGadol drasha in the very beginning of the 20th century, excoriating, actually, peanut oil. That it was kitniot, it was problematic. What is kitniot? So the Rishonim, the Maharil, and then finally canonized by the Ramah, offers two explanations. What is kitniot? Kitniot are legumes traditionally, but it's a very broad category in which other food items can fall into. But what is the concern about these kitniot items? Two possible reasons. One is that the way in which they are packaged and stored, it might be mixed in with kernels of grain. And so when you open up, say, a package of lentils, you might have, and you process it and you bake it, there may be kernels of wheat, and you will produce a smidgen of chametz, but a smidgen of chametz is still chametz on Passover. The other possibility is that you can bake it in such a way that it will look like bread or rise like bread, these kitniot items, and you will confuse people on Pesach. And this is the custom, the extra Talmudic custom. Abba Shaul and the Gemara in Pesachim actually celebrates the idea of eating kitniot. Sfardim, famously the Beit Yosef, had no idea why Ashkenazim adopted the stringency, but so it is that Ashkenazim have adopted the stringency of kitniot on Passover. And so the invention or the discovery of peanut oil on Passover was very well received in the Orthodox Jewish home. So much so that Planters billed itself as a Passover recipe from not just peanut oil, the Passover oil. And in the middle section you see over here, they produced a Yiddish cookbook in the 1940s with 46 recipes, in which the common denominator of each recipe, you guessed it, it used Planters peanut oil. And even if you preferred another brand, or excuse me, this is also Planters, they also produced journals in the rabbinic press, which is important because the rabbinic institutions accepted peanut oil as a valid ingredient on Passover. The Orthodox Union on the bottom left, for example, included peanut oil as one of the permitted items in its Passover directory. And this is an excerpt from Igros Moshe, from the response of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, Be'inyan peanut im yesh bo chashash iser min hakitniot. Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was queried twice in Igros Moshe about the fitness of peanut oil on Passover. Each time said absolutely. He recalled growing up in Eastern Europe that he would snack. There wasn't much else to eat on Passover, and peanuts. So he remembers snacking on peanuts when he was a young child on Passover. And it was so noticeable that there was Jewish consumption of peanut oil that during World War II, when other oils needed to be reserved for the war effort to grease tanks and other machinery, the U.S. Department of Agriculture suggested that peanut oil be that it proliferate, that it be endorsed by anybody and everybody so that other oils could be used. Peanut oil apparently wasn't good for military machinery. And part of its commentary to Congress was the better grades of refined peanut oil are used in certain salad oil blends for which it is considered to have a superior value. So have it on your salad. A white form of refined peanut oil enjoys much popularity among the Jewish trade in several Eastern cities. Talks about the Irish in the subsequent sentence, but everybody's taking note that Jews are taking quite a bit to peanut oil on Passover. This doesn't last, though. By the 1960s, 1970s, a Hungarian folkway has migrated. And I mentioned Satmarov's grandfather, well, Satmarov too, was very much opposed to peanut oil and what it stood for. It's not a small thing. It sounds rather pedantic. But first of all, when it comes to food, people are very sensitive about their culinary proclivities. But more than that, it speaks to the home, the Jewish home, which principally at this time the women, but the women and men were the sovereigns in their home. And nonetheless, so here you have in the 1980s, Rabbi Beryl Levy of the OK publishes in the Jewish Homemaker, a very interesting publication, published in his Passover volume, the following towards the end of one of the magazines. Because this is a Pesach issue, and I always, on the left side, always have many inquiries about peanut oil, and we give our hechsher on Planters peanut oil, so he's invested in the enterprise. I again wish to print, it's not the first time he's done it, the tshuva, a private tshuva. So now I mentioned there were two that were published, here's a third one, of Hagaon Rabbi Moshe Feinstein Shlita, he's still alive in the early 80s, with reference to peanuts and peanut oil. And then he gives you the translation, and Rav Moshe is not happy with the chumrah of desisting from peanut oil. And yet, even one of his greatest disciples, Rabbi Shimon Eider, who publishes probably the most well-used Passover manual in the late 1970s, while Moshe is still alive. He writes, under liquids and other derivatives, concerning the question of whether liquids, namely, for example, corn syrup and other derivatives of kitniot, for example, which comes from soybeans, is used in chocolates and other foods, are included in the gezerah of kitniot, and whether peanuts and peanut oil in brackets are considered as kitniot. There are various opinions among the poskim. Various opinions. Rav Moshe, Rav Henkin, the entire Lithuanian rabbinate supported the use of peanut oil on Passover. It's this Hungarian folkway which has challenged it. One should conduct himself or herself according to his or her minhag. If one is uncertain of his minhag, a Rav should be consulted. And so already in the 1960s to the 1980s, you see peanut oil is shifting, and the diet, the Orthodox diet is changing because of a confluence of circumstances of what is considered to be the most authentic. It's an extra halachic, it's extra Talmudic issue, is kitniot. You can't pinpoint any passage in the Talmud to do it, but the sensibility, in the sense of what is authentic, what is fitting, what makes sense right now, it's also happening at a time of major identity politics in the United States, of ethnic sensibilities. This is what is overtaking, this folkway is overtaking the erstwhile version of it in Orthodox Jewish life. And a separate iteration of it came out quite recently. The Orthodox Jews basically discovered quinoa 20 years ago, is my sense of the situation. Quinoa broadens Pesach menu, but sparks a rabbinical debate. Star K, I think, was the first one to approve of it. The OU eventually came back to support it, certain brands of quinoa, but essentially the same issue of a new item that needed to be assessed and processed in the rabbinic or even in the lay mind. Does it look right? Does this look kosher lePesach? Was the question. That is solely a question of authenticity. Another example of what is authentic or not is the invention of the Bar Mitzvah. Their very first Bar Mitzvah was in 1922, was Judith Kaplan, the daughter of Mordechai Kaplan. And he represented the left flank, but he was a major figure in the conservative movement. That was what was considered a bat mitzvah. Conservative Jews did bat mitzvah, Reform did confirmation, and the Orthodox, particularly in New York, had no truck with the bat mitzvah ceremony. So much so that in the late 1950s, you have in the very first source is Rabbi Pinchas Teitz, HaKonservativiot. He Tenuat Shitim. He's delivering this. This is a speech he's giving at the Agudas HaRabbanim annual convention. HaKonservativiot. He Tenuat Shitim. It is a drifting movement. That's a pun. Shapirza Gderot Tenuat Yisrael. It has made breaches. Has encroached upon the modesty of the Jewish people. Tenuat Yisrael. Kol Yaseh Kol Chavtza L'Chalel Kedushat Yisrael Tarto. It's on a mission. It's conservative Judaism, and it's alleged to destroy, to profane all that is holy about Judaism. He Yisrael at Kol Batei Tfilotim, not at Beit Knesset, but they're holy, their worship places. What do they form? What's at the foundation of these conservative synagogues? Again, his words, not mine. Teruvat Nashim Va'anashim. They have mixed pews. Everybody knows that. Friday night services. That's Hebrew for Friday night services. When in the wintertime, when people were working still, when the Shabbos would begin. Conservative, but also some Orthodox congregations also. Again, showing just how challenging it was to come to terms with what exactly is Orthodox Judaism, would hold later services for families whose parents were working. Bat mitzvah is another indicator of what is evil about conservative Judaism, and Nashim Morshim Lomer Kaddish, and women who deign to recite Kaddish. He wasn't alone. Rabbi Eliezer Silver, the unofficial chief rabbi of Orthodox Jews, certainly in the first half of the 20th century, Kain Askim al ha'isr shikris mar al asher yichalu lachet bechukei hareformim. He means conservative, not reform. Lachug chagigot habagrut. I absolutely think there's an isser. It's forbidden to celebrate a celebration of a young girl's maturity into womanhood, a bat mitzvah. The kol zeh bechla chadash aser. It's all new. It's all innovative, and therefore invoking the Chatam Sofer's famous adage, chadash aser min Torah, that anything is new is aser, is forbidden from the Torah. Bat mitzvah was considered to be something patently unorthodox. And before we get there, this is the Hebrew school class at Lincoln Square Synagogue, and the young woman in the front, second from the right, is the very first bat mitzvah at Lincoln Square Synagogue, who is now, I mentioned Brandeis, so it's only appropriate, Lena Kagan. That is a picture of her around her bat mitzvah. She's the very first bat mitzvah. But even at Lincoln Square Synagogue, Rabbi Riskin understood, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, that is, understood the challenges of instituting bat mitzvah. And so in the newsletter of Lincoln Square Synagogue, not much to do about it. At KJ, Rabbi Haskellitzian on the other side of the park did make much ado over it, over his own daughter being bat mitzvah. But a year earlier, Rabbi Riskin was very circumspect, was very chary about it, and it was in the Mazel Tov. Congrats, Mazel Tov to Mr. and Mrs. Kagan on the bat mitzvah of their daughter Elena, but not much more than that. He was very careful about bringing out something new. And while we're on the topic of what is authentic, I mentioned how womanhood and women's issues was always somehow used as a measuring stick for the contours of Orthodox Jewish life. Here you have women's Talmud, for instance. And here you have a young girl at Yeshiva Moshe Soloveitchik on the upper in Washington Heights, and a well-known picture. This one doesn't have Bernie Sanders as an interloper. That was going around social media last week and this week, is Rabbi Soloveitchik in 1977, the Rav Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, delivering the very first lecture at Stern College for Women in their newly endowed Stern Beit Midrash program. But even before that, even before that is women's Talmud is taken for granted as being permissible, so much so that Rabbi Haskell Luckstein writes a letter in 1968. Dear parents, Ramaz High School conducts an honors program in Talmud for selected and qualified students who are both deserving of participation in such a program and interested in it. And it's a letter asking people to register for this course, and here is the registration card. And if you were, maybe it was, even though Ramaz is co-ed, maybe it was only open up to boys, I hereby request that my son or daughter be registered for the Talmud Honors Program. I was taken for granted that was permitted. Also of note was the teacher, was Rabbi Julius Parnas, Rabbi Yehuda Parnas, Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshiva University, who eventually leaves YU. According to most news accounts at the time, is the founding Rosh Yeshiva at Lander College. One of his reasons for departing was the institution of the Advanced Women's Talmud Program, GPATS, at Yeshiva University in the early 2000s. So what's happening? What's happening in the 1980s is a question of authenticity. And here, Peter Berger, the great social theorist, in his book, The Heretical Imperative, he singles out in the first chapter the situation of Orthodox Judaism. Yet those who affirm an Orthodox or even a moderately Orthodox version of Jewish identity continue to define the latter as such a fact. Their problem is that they must affirm it in the face of empirical evidence to the contrary. What Berger is suggesting in the 1980s is that with technology and modernity, as we said before about the chief rabbin, the concept of chief rabbinate, it's a voluntaristic society. People have to opt in. All of us are opting in every single day to be Orthodox Jews. We're not taxed that way. We aren't identified in our citizenship records as Orthodox Jews. Every single day, I wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning to get to davening reasonably on time at 6:45. I am electing, me personally, I am choosing once again to be an Orthodox Jew today. Today. We all are making that choice. Nobody is compelling us. The problem is that they must affirm in the face of empirical evidence to the contrary. We don't make such a declaration each morning, but we think it, at least intuitively. The Orthodox precisely defines Jewish identity as destiny, while the social experience of the individual reveals it as an ongoing choice, which I just described. The dissonance between definition and experience is at the core of every orthodoxy in the modern world. It's always choice. There's no such thing as an orthodoxy anymore. We don't feel compelled. We're not latched onto it. It's quite nice that each day we get to choose to be Orthodox again. The Orthodox defines himself as living in a tradition. It is of the very nature of tradition to be taken for granted. This taken for grantedness, however, is continually falsified by the experience of living in a modern society. The Orthodox must then present to himself as faith what he knows empirically to be a choice. This is a difficult feat. And he anticipates, does Peter Berger, is that later he has some contrition over this paragraph. But for the time, in the late 1970s, moving into the early 1980s, that Orthodox Judaism doesn't stand a chance. It's elective. People have to opt in. It's going to fall. Modern society is too powerful. The modernity of choice people aren't going to stick around. And yet people do. Maybe we'll close with some of these slides. How do they do it? They create an Orthodox counterculture in a particular population, but one which is pervasive within Orthodox Jewish life. How do they do it? Rather than offering a spelling bee, Torah Masorah comes up in the 1970s with a bracha bee. And instead of collecting baseball cards, this article, so the left article is from the New York Times. The article in the middle is from Time magazine. Hey, I'll trade you a Ruderman for a Feinstein. No, this is not a proposed baseball card swap, but the kind of deal that might occur among children with a religious bent, trading, and you missed the section over there, trade you a Ruderman for a Feinstein, right? A McGuire for a Sosa, a Ripken for a Ruth, whatever it might be. They are creating rabbi cards in place of baseball cards. The modern Orthodox are somewhat incredulous. This is from a Lampoon issue in the Yeshiva University magazine, Hamavaser. Chops, playing off of Tops, a baseball card. Chops Chewing Gum presents centrist Orthodox Gedolim cards, reprinting of the classic modern Orthodox, making fun of the fact that the modern Orthodox have changed their name to the centrist Orthodox. Gedolim set issued 10 years ago. Collect both cards. We don't have rabbi cards in the modern Orthodox world. And even in more recent times, Lego, this is from a publication called Mishpacha Junior, produced binyan blocks. Why? Part of its founding story in this interview. One of my partners explains one of the founders of Binyan Blocks was building a shul out of Lego with his kids, and he realized that the pieces were really limited in what they allowed you to do. He approached me and said, let's create something that Hamish kids can enjoy. A lot of the Lego themes out there aren't so appropriate for frum kids. We wanted to create Legos that could be used to build the things that are more meaningful to us. So a children's culture at home, invented by creative people. Yes, bracha by rabbis, but Gedolim cards by an accountant and by three people looking for the best interests of Hamish kids also, not rabbis about binyan blocks. How do they do it? Well, it's the day schools. As my teacher, Jonathan Sarna, has put it, at least in speech, if not in writing, Orthodox Judaism in the post-war period bet the house on education, and they won. And here you see the spike in day schools over time. In it's called the day school boom in 1945 to 1965. You can see those numbers. In 1965, the largest yeshiva, University, then a Satmar yeshiva. Beis Medrash Gavoa, Lakewood, for example, only numbered a little bit over 200 in 1965. Most day school kids identify not as the part of the yeshiva world, but what we would call today the modern Orthodox community. That changes, though, over time. Here are the numbers, the official numbers of the Beis Medrash Gavoa, given to me by its CEO, Rabbi Aaron Cutler. There's a spike, just as Peter Berger predicted that Orthodox Jewish life would somehow falter to the painfulness of modern sensibilities. And yet, it flourished. Maybe do a couple more slides, just so we can see them and go pretty quickly through them. Happy to provide these slides to anybody who would like. And so when the yeshiva world grappled with issues, well, they knew what they were doing. So, for instance, the Pew study of of Jews in the United States in 2013, excuse me, and they're supposed to produce an update any minute now for our current moment, asked a question about the importance of intellectual curiosity to one's Jewishness. If you look, Orthodox Jews identified much lower with this statement than most Jews and of its denominational counterparts. But if you take a look at the modern Orthodox on the bottom left, the modern Orthodox actually, they reported quite highly about how important intellectual curiosity was to their Jewish identity, even higher than the rank and file Jews. So what's the reason of the overall poor reporting? Number one is because the modern Orthodox at this moment only represent 30% of the total Orthodox population in the United States. And the yeshiva world and the so-called yeshivish community and also the Hasidic community report much lower on intellectual curiosity. But what's interesting, again, about women's issues, quite curious what's happening at this moment, is when you do a deeper dive and a cross-tabbing of the data, you see on the right that it's true that yeshivish men report quite low on intellectual curiosity and how it is tethered to their Jewishness, but yeshivish women actually report like the modern Orthodox. They're very curious and they're very innovative. So it's always been an issue in the last 30 years to understand, well, what do you do about Orthodox women? It's interesting, some of the responses. So for example, the president of the Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbi Louis Bernstein, was challenged of whether or not he could accept women's prayer groups. And it was much debated in the Jewish press in the mid-1980s. And he did not answer. We heard the same argument on mixed pews, and fortunately, so many stood their ground, almost equating with conservative Judaism. Torah study for women, Rabbi Soloveitchik supported his teacher. Yes. Co-opting of our most able men and women for communal leadership? Yes. Maintaining the traditional sanctity of the synagogue? Most emphatically, yes. There was a sort of an imbalance on how to provide high level of learning for women, at the same time offer them a certain space in the synagogue. But it's the yeshiva world that has actually been able to answer it, I think, most positively, interestingly enough, about the place of women. So, for example, a few years ago, there was an interesting court case in which Rebbitzins of Kolo wives, but Rebbitzins, so the wives of Kolo men in Portland, Oregon, were subpoenaed on a particular court case, and they argued that they didn't need to because of clerical privilege, because they were somehow part of the rabbinate, or were they? And so, in this case, you see is that Orthodoxy's position, second paragraph, that women cannot be ordained rabbis. It's true, we're not arguing they're rabbis. The Kolo wives were in fact officially hired by the Kolo to minister. So what's interesting is that how has Orthodoxy measured itself with the case of women, issuing women parsonage, clerical privilege, is that the yeshiva world has been a step ahead, maybe, of the modern Orthodox and how to respond. And this is an excerpt from the Orthodox Union's rabbinical panel on the place of women's leadership in the synagogue from a number of years ago. And you see how the rabbinic panel understands Masorah. You see that they use the word authentic, that it's about its fitness within our society, how modernity mediates this confluence of factors of how we describe ourselves as Orthodox. Running out of time, so just very, very briefly, I want to get up to our present moment. I promise we get to our own time, is the question of authority. And this is sort of the comeback of the rabbis, of the Orthodox rabbinate, in defining the dimensions of Orthodox Jewish life. And it comes to the question of really who gets to speak for a tradition faith community. Here we're back in the Jewish Observer, and in the bios, the biographical identifiers of people or non-rabbis who are writing articles in the Agudas Jewish Observer in the 70s and 80s all identify how they support a rabbinic establishment, which is quite interesting. And of course, also looming large. And here is Rabbi Abraham J. Tversky claims that he doesn't have das Torah, of this rabbinical intuition to exercise authority in non-halachic matters. Why does he not have das Torah? Because he's too much secular knowledge, which is quite interesting. Rabbi Soloveitchik is not a fan of this rabbinic authority of das Torah. I resent it very much that certain Rosh Yeshiva and certain teachers want to impose their will upon the boys. It's against the law. I don't know if he means the halacha or American law. Rabbi Lamb is deeply discouraged over the heightened rabbinic authority of the 1980s. It's all happening at the 1980s, which is very, very interesting. But I want to even look at how in our modern Orthodox enclave, how we look at authority. So for instance, if we look at our own moment of the current pandemic, which hopefully it looks like there's finally light at the end of the tunnel, look at the language that we use. And so by all accounts, Rabbi Aaron Glatt, Rabbi Dr. Aaron Glatt, doctor is very important here, has been rather Herculean in advising congregations and communities throughout the pandemic. Here is how he writes, I think still, a weekly update column of COVID-19. Here's the modern Orthodox expert and how he looks at his role in the Orthodox community. In just the past 24 hours, and this is right before Sukkot, I have been inundated with numerous pressing shilos, not queries, not medical questions, shilos from communities all over regarding COVID-19 exposures. Here are but a few of the quarantine questions that Rabbanim and shul presidents have asked me. And he's not weighing in on truly halachic issues. He does it sometimes, of where to blow the shofar, for example, other questions at this time. But when he uses shilos, so even the modern Orthodox community, and this is maybe a good place to conclude, when it looks at authority now and how we do our version of brachabis. Brachabis are quite fun, after all. How we might not play with kosher Lego, but we too have absorbed a certain language to describe how we describe an authentic voice in our community. And I think that expertise in our time throws a very, very bright light on the picture. Here is a very leading figure, somebody who is an infectious disease expert, leads a major hospital in that field. And he is in his rhetoric, outward-facingly describing what he's doing is answering shilas in the community. And even where I am in Chicago, here you have not rabbis, but doctors. And this is how they begin a letter to the Chicago Jewish community in September 25th, 2020. We, the undersigned, from physicians of the Chicago Jewish community. Now, it's true that Dr. Fauci did address the Orthodox Union once, but how we want to absorb the rhetoric and the expertise during the COVID-19 pandemic, our experts think, and they're probably right, that we want them to relay, that they get the social cues, the peculiarities, the idiosyncrasies of our community. And so we, the undersigned, from physicians of the Chicago Jewish community, have been watching with growing alarm and asking people to please behave and wear masks during, I think this is for Simchas Torah. My point here is that what is seen as authentic, whether it's how we bake and cook on Passover, whether it's how we bring women in to reach their highest intellectual ceilings with Talmud learning or in the synagogue, or whether it's kosher Lego and brachabis, or it's even how we have a dialogue about the current pandemic, all of it is wrapped around what we think we need as an authentic Jewish voice. What is it? It's not sliding to the left or sliding to the right. What every tradition-bound faith, and particularly for what Orthodox Judaism in the United States demands, is that we try to negotiate, try to find that sweet spot called authenticity. When we do that, we've made more people happy than the opposite. But when society moves from decade to decade, when we are challenged with new issues, if it's not peanut oil, then it's kosher Lego, then it's brachabi, then it's how we have a conversation about COVID-19. All of this it summons us to find a new compromise of what is and isn't authentically Orthodox. Thank you so much. So I'm happy to answer questions. I went a little bit long. Nobody seemed to drop, so thank you. And I'm looking at some questions. So, right, so thank you. Yeah, about 1,000 people at that JOFA conference. Right, it was a major moment. They only printed, I think, enough programs for 200, and they had 1,000 participants. And again, in its moment was very important, and the resurgence of feminism and the Hillary Clinton pantsuit that did much for that moment. Absolutely.
I'll just chime in and say if people want to unmute themselves and verbally ask a question, that's fine too.
And a lot of the sources, Rabbi Julius Parnas was a particularly interesting source. I haven't brought that to his attention recently, but it is him.
And what did he say?
Oh, I didn't bring it to his attention. He taught the Talmud lecture. He taught it. Rabbi Mordechai Willig taught the very first year of the Stern Talmud program in 1977. And at its moment, and it really, I mentioned the women's tefillah group movement, which was a major issue in the 1980s. These women couldn't understand what was different. You let us study Talmud. We said we're not feminists. They called it the F word. If we wanted to daven, this is what Cheryl Hout, one of its prime leaders, made the argument. We don't want to daven in a conservative synagogue. We don't consider ourselves feminists. To the contrary, we're not looking for equal share. It's not egalitarian. We want to kick the men out. We want to do our own service. They couldn't, for the life of them, understand what they interpreted as inconsistent notwithstanding halachic issues that are local to each issue, Talmud versus women's prayer. But they couldn't understand the lack of, I would say, the bargaining. In a recent article, I made the argument that the yeshiva world in America functions a lot like the Amish. And I mean that actually kindly. The scholars of the Amish refer to what they do as a bargaining with modernity. So at one epoch, electric lawnmowers are absolutely not permitted. Even if you remove the electric motor, it's still not permitted if you want to use its shearing mechanism. But 20 years later, the weed whacker, if you could model it a little bit differently, was permitted. And you're not allowed to use a phone, certainly, in your home. But if you are, if Rahman al-Atlan, you are working in a place that you have to use a phone, you're allowed to own one. And so the way that the Amish bargain, and it creates inconsistencies in how they practice and how they stay away from modernity and technology. Similarly, all tradition-bound faiths, we absorb, we imbibe certain spirits at certain moments, and it creates inconsistencies. Best example, perhaps, is the peanut oil versus the quinoa. The Orthodox Union does not certify any brand of peanut oil. It's not worth anybody's time to try to certify it or produce kosher Pesach peanut oil, and yet quinoa, which is the exact same issue, is permitted. From a halachic perspective, totally inconsistent. But when you understand that one's happening in the 70s and the other one is happening in a much more modern moment with Twitter and people in backlash, that's what really happened with quinoa. Not this time. So there's an inconsistency, but from a historical perspective, that those multiple layers of how things were brought in or pushed out of the fold make a good deal of sense, because at one point it was authentic and the other time it wasn't.
Well, I'll say that when I grew up in the 70s, peanut oil was absolutely kosher Pesach, and everyone used it.
And it was the Passover oil.
Yeah.
Right.
But how do you, so I guess I do have a question. So taking the example of the peanut oil and the quinoa, so how do you see the definition of authenticity changing such that, you know, in the peanut oil case, authenticity demanded that we hold the line and say basically l'chumra for the peanut oil, but then in the 2000s with quinoa, authenticity allows for a more lenient approach.
And so what's happening at the moment in the 1970s that you have this Hungarian folkway and these Jews who are dressed in a certain way, they are, as Charles Liebman pointed out in 1979, that is what an authentic Jew looks like, with the strima, with everything else. And again, I have no horse in the race, from a historian's point of view. At that time of highly charged identity politics, in which Jews needed to take ownership of their identity, Orthodox Jews were looking to the Hungarians in their chumras as a model of Jewish behavior inside or outside the home, and that folkway is a mighty folkway, and it really does push the Passover oil off of the shelves and out of the home.
It makes everything glatt.
Excuse me?
It makes everything glatt kosher.
Well, right, glatt kosher. The idea of glatt really means smooth lungs, but now we've applied to everything. It's a Hungarianism, very much so. But that takes hold in the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then when you have quinoa, which is untethered to an earlier politic of any Shabbos Hagadol Dresha from beforehand, and we have loosened our binds to an identity politic in the 21st century. The Orthodox Judaism has come really to be much more pluralistic and open-minded, and as Peter Berger said, is that modernity has forced us to open up our boundary lines. People, whoever's in the kitchen, man or woman, says absolutely not this time. And eventually the rabbinic folkway gives way. First the Star K, then eventually the Orthodox Union allow quinoa, and it's happening at a different moment. That the chips with which to bargain are colored differently decades later.
So religion is not locked into one mode. If you look at reform today, it's like nothing like it was 40 years ago. The reformers that I know and have been a part of would not recognize it if they went to the Reform Synagogue in White Plains or any place else today. And so it seems like with Orthodoxy and all of religion is a dynamic activity, and perhaps ever was. Am I correct about that?
I don't know. I think it always exists, particularly in America, where we are untethered to past traditions. Right? There's no such thing as minhag White Plains. Maybe there is. There's minhag Poland. There's minhag Ashkenaz. We have resisted trying to create static traditions here. But your point is well taken. Is that in 1885 there was nothing worse to a Reformed Jew. Well, we'll say 1897 because the term wasn't crystallized until then. Zionism. Zionism? The return of Zion? Absolutely not. That was one of the tenets of Reform Judaism. We don't believe in that. But by 1937, with the Columbus platform, Reform Jews reabsorb the planks of Zionism. And there's a lot more Hebrew liturgy. For example, now the most recently printed Reform prayer book has very traditional language. Absolutely. And you see that what's going on in the conservative movement. There's a certain return to tradition and text study. Everything is bound by change. Everything is what philosophers might say is indexical. It's always changing. There's always a moving target. Not to say that halacha changes, but in terms of just the contours of the acceptability of certain behaviors and sensibilities are always reacting and changing to the present moment.
I have cousins in Israel who, together with several of their friends, have just given up on kitniot. They said, we can't do this anymore. The products in Israel, the canned goods, will tell you what's okay with it. It was driving them crazy. and they made a decision. They're 100% Orthodox. They will not honor this stupid thing.
What's happening in Israel? Well, what's happening in Israel is that you have much more of marriage between Sephardim and Ashkenazim. They're living in much closer
That happened
proximity.
also, yes.
And you have, so I think it's Ravad Yosef has an essay in which he says it's perfectly fine for an Ashkenaz man to adopt his Sephardic wife's Sephardic minhagim, but it doesn't have to work the opposite.
So don't we have any rabbinic authorities in the Orthodox community that has the guts to say, we have no longer required this observance of Kitniot. We now are in a modern age and we know what wheat is and we know what peanuts are and we know what beans are and all that stuff. We no longer require the observance of the Kitniot. We have Orthodox, modern Orthodox, RCA, OU. Can't we organize ourselves to do something intelligent in the modern age?
So all I can say is that when Shira introduced me, she said I was a historian, not a political scientist. That's something that I'm not so sure of. But your point is well taken about the idea of change, and especially in a time in which every move is documented and our surveillance and discussion, everybody could tweet or post something on Facebook. I think that our willingness to change in the modern period, particularly in America, is stymied. Again, whether change or not is worthy is a separate issue, but the capacity for change is to a great extent hindered by our modes of communication. Minhagim developed and were modified and were augmented in Europe because it took weeks, even years, for communities to connect to one another. Here, we know exactly how people are davening. We know exactly how people are behaving because we Instagram and we Facebook. Even in the 1970s, it's because we still had modes of communication which were far faster than anything in 19th century Eastern Europe.
So we're just abdicating to the Hungarians. Basically, that's what has happened.
I had a quick question, if it's okay, with regard to the use of the word temple. You drew attention to that earlier in the talk. Just from family history, I was under the impression that the word temple was used kind of across all denominations in the Midwest. And then what I've seen is that on the East Coast, it seems to be more strongly associated with Reformed denominations. And I'm wondering if you've seen any trends with that.
That's interesting about the Midwest. Temple was always associated much more with Reform than anything else, particularly in the 19th century when you had these temples being built, and also there was so much wealth in the Reform movement. So whereas there seemed to be a correlation between storefronts being Orthodox congregations in the 19th century, these cavernous, usually refurbished churches becoming temples. So it sort of matched what was going on. So that's why I called attention to it, because it seemed to me very rare that a congregation calling themselves Orthodox would have called their synagogue structure a temple. The question of Midwest, nothing, I'm sure you're right. I'm sure it comes from somewhere. It happens to be that most congregations in the 19th century, because Eisner Wise was in Cincinnati and Chicago also was a major Reform center, as was Detroit and elsewhere, is that most of the congregations in the Midwest were Reformed. That they adopted, but there might have been fluidity and they would not necessarily have changed the word temple to synagogue. So it could be. But certainly at that point in Boston in particular, for an Orthodox congregation to call their structure a temple rather than a synagogue seemed strange. I don't know what to make of that.
Zev, I think we're going to need to leave it there. The hour is late and I think we're out of time, but thank you again so much. This was a fascinating evening and we appreciate your coming to talk to us tonight.
Thanks. I saved on the airfare. Everybody be safe and be well. Thank you so much for having me.
Good night.